All right, we're back with another course. And in this course, we're really going to be looking at how do we write code? Why do we write code? What is code? Now, in this course, there's a few things that we're going to look at. The first thing is going to be programming languages. What are they? Why are they important? Second thing will be syntaxes and semantics. Then we're going to look at functions, arrays, and some more interesting things. Also, we're going to be looking at things like data types, pointers, classes, etc. And then the last third or half of this course, we're going to be looking at Arduino projects. Now, for these first four topics, we're going to be using Microsoft's Visual Studio. And for the later half, we're going to be looking at the Arduino IDE and Arduino boards. Now, if you are asking, why are we using Visual Studio and Arduino? Well, to frankly be honest, the copyright restrictions and wording on many of these applications is very hard to go through. But if we look at Microsoft Visual Studio, right, so you can see here, you can work in a lot of different languages, but more importantly, if we scroll down to the usage, it seems that we should not have any copyright problems with this, along with the Arduino platform. Again, it appears that licensing, copyright, and all that fun stuff shouldn't be a problem, so we shouldn't be getting any copyright strikes, but if we do, unfortunately, I'll have to make a video halfway through this course that, course canceled. Unfortunately, we're gonna have to try to divert it and make it work some other way. But for now, we can hope for the best, and this is what we're going to be using. So the first thing that we can ask is, what is a programming language? And if we look back to the Intro to EE course, we know that if we want to speak to some kind of electronics, in this case it's a computer, we really need to speak in some specific kind of format. Unfortunately, electronics do not care about our feelings, and if we just get upset and try to brute force something, it doesn't always work. Now, in more modern times, thanks to AI, we can kind of tell AI to do something, and AI will generate sometimes good, sometimes bad code, and we can plug that in and we can see what happens. But moving on, what we really need to consider is the concept that we need something to turn our instructions into doable commands for the electronics. So if we draw a black box, we know that we have some code that we write, something happens in this black box, and then it ends up turning into binary, and that will go to the electronics. Now inside this black box, you can have something like a preprocessor, a compiler, assembler, and a linker, and then most of the times you'll be injecting some form of libraries to reference to. And that's kind of the quick overview of what this black box is. Now, if we go into the details, it gets pretty complex, much more in depth than we can really handle for the courses that we've already looked at. But for now, we just want to know that a lot goes into the black box. So going into some of the programming languages or frameworks, we can have a plethora of different languages. For example, you might have heard of JavaScript or Python. We can also have things like HTML or CSS, or we can have our family of C. And specifically for this course, we are going to be looking at C++. Now, we're not going to be looking at C++ because it is superior or it is the king. And maybe you're asking, well, why are we even using C++? Maybe something like Java is so much better. Well, if you're watching this video, there's probably two things that you fall into. Either you're in EE trying to learn code, and for that, it really doesn't matter which language you choose. Or you have some interest in hobby projects that involve writing code. Now for that, something like the Arduino platform are superior. And to our benefit, Arduino uses a C++ variant. So kind of, getting through the overview of what we're going to be looking at in this course, we can start to kick things off. And to do that, we're going to look at something called a token. And there's a few different tokens that we can look at, and these have significant meaning to that black box above. So one of the tokens we can have, they are keywords, and really they have special meaning. So some examples could be int, which signifies an integer, double, for, while, and the list goes on. we can have operators, and that's going to deal with our math and logic. Next, we can have literals, and this would be something like letter A to this string OK. We can then have identifiers, and those are used to denote functions and such things. We'll get into that later in this course. And then perhaps the most fun thing, that's punctuation. So that's our commas, semicolons, parentheses, brackets. Now that we've gone through some of the tokens, let's look at where we're actually going to be writing our code. So what we can do is open up Visual Studio, and installing Visual Studio is a little bit complex. I'll put a link to the video that I used in the description, but overall, there's a few things once you open it up. So in this main space here, this is where you're going to be writing your code. In the bottom here, you're going to have an output window or debug or terminal or ports. Really, we're going to be using the output and the terminal. You have, of course, your file menu. On the left here, you can look in your projects and your extensions. Now, the extensions I'm running, C, C++, and then CodeRunner. Now, CodeRunner is nice because it works pretty good for the output. And then on the right here, you will have your run file. And then down here, you can actually do things like clear the terminal, or in this case, the output. Now, if you're creating a new file, you can just go new text file. You can select your language. In this case, we would select C++. And then you can just take that file and save it somewhere, and then you can start working on it. And before we actually dive into that code, we're gonna denote a few things. So if you have a double backslash, this is going to define the start of a comment. Now, a comment doesn't do anything. It's not in the code. It's just kind of there. Next, we can have hashtag include, and this is going to include a header file. We have things like namespaces, and this utilizes a mapping of syntax to their defined responsibilities. You'll see something like using namespace and then whatever namespace you want to use. So consider using multiple libraries, or maybe I should cross this out and put namespaces, just because we are looking at namespaces and this might get a little bit confusing if we keep using the word library. But if we use multiple namespaces and we write some code that uses a common word, per se, in each of the namespaces with different responsibilities tied to it, well, we might not get what we're looking for. And in that case, we might choose to use the scope operator instead. So instead of using the use namespace or using namespace command, we would use the scope operator, and it would be in the standard library. And then we can use, whatever we need to use. And lastly, we are going to look at this int main. We have double parentheses or open and closed, and then we have our squiggly brackets. Now this is what we're going to define the block of code to execute in. So all of the code that we want to execute is going to go in between these squiggly brackets. So with that being said, we can actually jump back into Visual Studio. So the first thing you can see here is with line 1, and we can write a description for our code. So our code is going to output a text as like, comment, share, subscribe. Now we notice if we get rid of these backslashes, you can see right here, we get this little red bar that pops up and we get an error. So let's add back in those backslashes. And now we can move on to line 2. So that's going to be include, and there is our input output. Line 3, you can see that we're using the namespace, and the namespace that we're going to use is the standard. And notice here after this line, we have the semicolon to signify an ending of it. Again, if we get rid of that, you get a red line, you get an error. So it's very common when you want to end a line of code to have that semicolon there. You can see here in line 2, we actually don't have that semicolon. So sometimes it's a little bit tricky. So just having a break between line 4, we can actually have line 5 as where we have that int main, those parentheses, and then the squiggly bracket. And then in line 6, we're using the output command, which is this cout, and then we have this less than, and then in quotations we have like, comment, share, subscribe, and then we end that again with the semicolon. So this is the code that we are going to execute, and then after we execute that code, we finish off that squiggly bracket, and that's going to close the main. So what we can do now is go over to this play button, and we are just going to hit run code. And you can see that it outputted here, like, comment, share, subscribe. But let's actually comment out this using namespace, and then we can use that scope command in the standard library to also do this same code. And we're going to run the code, and you can see here if we scroll down to the bottom, we got the exact same output. Now we can clear the output right here with this little button. And I think this is where we can end the first video. We covered a lot, and if this is the first time you're ever writing any code, this might be a lot to take in. In the next video, we'll get to a few modifications that we can do with this code, a few more things that we can add in, and then we'll start building and building all throughout this course. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything new, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.